everyone, this is Tanya. Welcome back to Black Women Read, reviews of books, zines, and everything in between. I love audiobooks. It's a great way to catch up on interesting new books that I don't have time to read, especially as a busy mama. A couple of weeks ago, I eagerly downloaded They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. Jones Rogers is an assistant professor in the Department of History at UC Berkeley. They Were Her Property was a fascinating listen, and I'm still trying to process all that I learned regarding the historical role of white women during the slave trade. White women were just as cruel, greedy, and violent as their male counterparts, sometimes more so, as slave ownership provided them with a space to exert power and authority in ways that they weren't normally allowed due to gender expectations at the time. Jones Rogers explains her work. My first book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, is a regional study that draws upon formerly enslaved people's testimony to dramatically reshape current understandings of white women's economic relationships to slavery. They Were Her Property foregrounds the testimony of enslaved and formerly enslaved people and puts their reflections into conversation with other narrative sources, legal documents, and financial records in order to show how white women's investments in the institution shaped their gender identities and to situate them at the center of 19th century America's most significant and devastating system of economic exchange. It was hard not to think about the film 12 Years a Slave while absorbing stories of white women slave owners' sadistic behavior towards their slaves, particularly black female slaves. 12 Years a Slave was released in 2013 and was based on the true account of freeman Solomon Northup, who was kidnapped and sold into slavery. After years in bondage, he was finally rescued with the help of friends and family. I always thought the real story of the 12 Years a Slave film was that of Patsy. Patsy was a fellow slave Northup befriended during his time on Edwin Epps' plantation. Patsy was raped multiple times by Epps and suffered horrible physical abuse by his wife, Mary. A criticism of slave films, especially 12 Years a Slave, is that they seem to engage in torture porn. And I agree, 12 Years a Slave could get gratuitous at times. However, this was the reality for a lot of slaves, especially black women slaves who had to endure not only sexual violence, but also had to deal with the wrath of jealous white wives who took out their personal frustrations of the blandness of their lives of being, quote-unquote, oppressed onto black women's bodies. They Were Her Property details the pleasure white women took doling out punishments to black girls and slave women. Jones Rogers shares about Henrietta King, a 9-year-old slave girl who was brutalized by her white mistress for taking candy. Jones Rogers writes, when she went to collect the pot in her mistress' room each morning, she noticed that a piece of candy would be left on the washstand. She knew that her mistress had left it there as a test to see whether she would take it, and at first she resisted. But after several days, King yielded to temptation. Her mistress, King claimed, kept the people who labored in her home in a state of near starvation. King's mistress noticed that the candy was gone and questioned her. When she denied stealing the candy, her mistress began to whip her. King refused to remain still, so her mistress grabbed her by the legs and pinned her head under the rocker of her chair, while her young daughter whipped her. For an hour, her mistress rocked back and forth on her head, while her daughter beat her with a cowhide. The constant pressure from the rocking chair crushed the bones in the left side of King's jaw. After the beating, she could not open her mouth, and the left side constantly slid sideways to the right. Her mistress called a doctor, but after examining her, he determined that nothing could be done. Her face was irreparably mutilated. Her mistress never brutalized King again, but her disfigurement was disquieting, and the mistress was so disturbed by it that the family decided to give King to a female cousin. This one act of brutality affected the rest of Henrietta King's life. She could not chew, so she was forced to consume liquid, stews, and soup. The teeth on the left side of her face never grew back. They Were Her Property provided insight into the ways white women embraced slavery, slave ownership with enthusiasm. Contrary to the idea, they were passively in the background as their husband or men in their lives did the quote-unquote dirty work of slave trading. Jones Rogers states, enslaved and formerly enslaved people recall the ways their female owners exercised authority over them. They made it clear that white women did not subordinate their authority to white men, nor did they confine themselves to operating at the mid-levels of power. Their status as slave owners granted them access to a community that was based upon the ownership of human beings and afforded them rights they did not possess in other realms of their lives. White women embraced their role within the community, assumed positions of power over slaves within and outside their households, and challenged anyone who attempted to infringe upon that power. And local, state, and federal courts recognized, upheld, and protected them when they did so. White women took on their roles as slave owners very seriously. It wasn't a hobby or something fun to do. They recognized the financial benefits of having slaves. Slaves were often passed on to them as a form of inheritance from their fathers, as well as social capital. The owning of slaves could be used as a bargaining chip to entice male suitors, and gave them a little more leverage in their households if they owned slaves and their husband did not, or not as many. This seriousness meant unleashing unrelenting terror on their slaves to show they were tough enough to manage slaves, although sometimes they had to bring in male overseers for times when a slave could not be controlled, such as in the case of Pauline Howe's aunt. Jones Rogers writes, Pauline Howe's enslaved aunt killed 2 male overseers after she grabbed their private parts and pulled them out by the roots. Afterward, her aunt was sold, along with all of her children, to a man who lived in Mobile, Alabama. I listened to that clip at least 6 times because I gained so much satisfaction from it. Rest in power. I felt a bit overwhelmed while listening to They Were Her Property. The book covers so much historical tidbits, testimonies, and laws. It's a lot to take in. It was especially unsettling to hear about the violent acts committed by white women slave owners, the fact that they sought their own freedom and empowerment from white men through the economic exploitation of black people, and especially their targeting and wanting to control black women. It's no different than today. Currently, there has been an amazing shift in the politics of many black Americans. The New American Descendants of Slavery, or ADOS movement, has caught a lot of people off guard. The focus of the ADOS movement is the rightful call of reparations for the systematic oppression black Americans have had to endure in this country. I support the ADOS movement, although it does create uncomfortable bedfellows. There are some folks part of the ADOS movement I find highly problematic, whether it be their issues of misogyny, colorism, etc. I don't romanticize the ADOS movement, but there are logical arguments to be made that black Americans are beyond owed for our exploitation, suffering, that has continued long after the end of slavery. I am also supporting the ADOS movement not so much for myself, but for my child. I might not ever receive anything the ADOS movement might gain, but I want my child to reap the benefits, as well as the next generation of black children. And after listening to They Were Her Property, I feel even more strongly about the ADOS movement. Black people need to be made whole, especially black women. This country was literally built off of our wombs. For the black slave woman whose children were sold so Mrs. could get a new dress, we are owed. For the black slave girl whose 9-month-old sister was beaten to death by a white woman because she cried too much. We are owed. Or the black slave woman whose head was bashed in for misbehaving on order from a white woman. We are owed. For the black slave woman viciously whipped but her breasts bared so she would be able to suckle white women's babies while her own children went without. We are owed. Thank you for listening, and I will see you at the next video.